Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam, and I study religious language and culture.
And I'm Dillon. I'm a Lutheran pastor.
Okay, so first and foremost, let's say that this might not be an episode that you want to listen to with young kids. So we'll just pause for a moment if you need to turn this off very quickly. Okay. Today's episode is about the word virgin, and this word has been the cause of many heresy charges and deaths throughout Christian history. People have strong opinions about this word. It's almost Christmas. It's still the Advent season. If you listened to our liturgy and Advent episodes, you understand what that means. And we are, in Christian circles, waiting the birth of Jesus. So, of course, we're going to talk about Mary. And this word virgin is all wrapped up in our understanding of Mary, the mother of Jesus of Nazareth. So I want to start this episode with a little parable that I've heard recently that I really love. So there's this monkey who is swinging in a tree and sees a fish swimming in the water below. And the monkey wanted to help the fish and save it from drowning. So it scooped the fish up out of the water and put it on a tree branch. The fish struggled and struggled until it ultimately died on the tree branch. I love that parable. There's a lot of meaning there. But I think that sometimes we think one environment or way of life or way of believing is what's right for everybody, and sometimes our help actually hurts. So I say this because a through line of our podcast episodes, one thing that keeps coming up over and over again is that there has always been and currently still are many ways to be a Christian. Some Christians swing in tree branches and some swim in water. People live into the story in many ways. So this specific episode, episode 11, is going to give some linguistic and cultural context to the word virgin. Just know that different people find different parts of the Jesus story as foundational and necessary. For me, Mary's virginity or lack thereof doesn't make or break the story for me. Honestly, the only thing for me, I think this is true for you too, Dillon, the only thing for me that could actually destroy the Christian story is if I learned that undoubtedly the earliest followers of Jesus were violent and greedy people who chose riches and power over compassion and community. If that was true, then I might not find value in this thing called Christianity.
I would agree.
Yeah. But otherwise, Mary's virginity, it's not the hill I'm going to die on. I don't really care. However, we are going to say some things in this episode that are not really arguable. They're just fact. There's just some translation facts there, and you can do with that what you may. Some other things are a little more murky and can be argued. So this episode is about what we do know about this word virgin as it relates to Mary, but then also just beyond Mary within the context of Christianity and culture in general. So let's start with the word virgin. The Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, was originally written in Hebrew. Obviously, we call it the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew word that's often translated as virgin, so the Hebrew word that gets translated into English as virgin, is alma. And this word in the original Hebrew that the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible was written in does not mean virgin. It gets translated into English oftentimes as virgin. It did not mean virgin. It meant young woman. So virginity was not implied in this translation. It just meant maiden or young woman. Eventually, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, and this Greek translation is called the Septuagint. An interesting side note, I really love this. I think it's really interesting. The Septuagint is named for the Latin number 70, Septuagint. It's named for the Latin number 70 because it's actually said that about 70 scholars, probably more like 72, but about 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And the legend goes that these 70 scholars went into separate spaces and they translated the Hebrew Bible independently. And when they came together to compare translations, apparently every single translation out of these 70 to 72-ish translations, they were identical. That's the story. And here begins the belief that the Bible is inerrant and without any complexities or contradictions or loss of translation. So, of course, anybody who's familiar with language knows that this is impossible. This is extremely unlikely. This legend has picked up traction over the centuries, as stories often do, but that's the story that we have. That's the legend that has taken shape over the centuries. So anyway, the Hebrew was translated into Greek, and we'll talk about why that was in a couple minutes. But the Greek word Parthenos, how am I saying
Parthenos.
Parthenos.
It has a good ring to it.
I never know where to put the, like rise in.
Parthenos.
Parthenos in Greek. I don't know why Hebrew sticks with me better than Greek does, but Parthenos is used to describe the woman who will birth Emmanuel. So we have this Hebrew word Alma, which doesn't mean virgin necessarily, right? And it was translated into Greek. And this is all before the English language even existed. Keep that in mind. So this Greek word Parthenos is used to describe a woman who will birth Emmanuel. And this word, again, when we eventually translate the Bible into English, we translate it as virgin. But again, it is not a given that this woman needs to be a virgin. So what's interesting is Hebrew did have a word for virgin, right? The Hebrew language had a word specifically to describe a woman who has not had sexual relationship with a man before. But that's not the word that is chosen, right? The person who wrote down this Hebrew Bible, this Old Testament story where they're talking about, I think it's in Isaiah, right?
It is. It's it's Isaiah 7, chapter 7:14.
Right.
Which is kind of the quote fulfillment passage.
Right.
But if you were to go probably look at your Bible today, and it's been translated into English, it will say virgin. But that is when you look in the Hebrew or an actual Hebrew, like a Hebrew Bible. That's not what it says.
It says Alma, which just means
which means
woman
either
or
young
maiden.
woman or maiden.
And then it gets translated into Greek. And again, I think this is really important. The Hebrew, the original language the Old Testament was written in, they had a word for virgin, and that's not the word that was chosen. So I think that's really telling. And then it's translated into Greek, and this Greek word means a young unmarried woman. So this can mean a lot of things. I do want to say that during this time, it is expected that if you are a young unmarried woman, that you are a virgin. So like culturally, it's kind of in there for sure. So I can see the hop.
Absolutely.
But again, they don't use the word for virgin. The Greek word that they use when they translate still means, instead of young woman, it's young unmarried woman tends to be wrapped up in there. It can also be used metaphorically. So this Greek word that we translate into English as virgin, also they use that to refer to land that is like pure or untouched. And also sometimes a person who is pure or untouched. Which is, if you're into like eco-linguistics or ecofeminism, which I really am, which is really this concept that oftentimes cultures that oppress women are also oppressing the earth, and we use language for both women and the earth, and we see this in this Greek language as well, right? Like we talk about women and our planet and the earth. We use words like plow. There's so many of them.
Yeah, plowing.
Rape. We rape the earth, and women are raped, right?
Well,
plowing the fields.
Reaping and sowing.
Reaping and sowing, right? So just women and the earth, and researchers have documented this for a while now. Cultures that do not take care of their soil, their earth, their land well, are also abusing their women. So that's all wrapped up in patriarchy, where there's male leadership and they think they own women and they own the land and they get to do whatever they want with it. So that's just a little side tangent. But anyway, so this word for young unmarried woman can also be used metaphorically to refer to a person or land that is pure or untouched. So we can kind of see virgin like themes in there. But again, they had a word for virgin. This wasn't it. So again...
and we'll maybe get into this a little bit more. But it's only St. Matthew's Gospel that has the fulfillment passages, linking almost directly Jesus to the fulfillment of the coming of the Jewish Messiah, the Anointed One. You only find that story in Matthew's Gospel, which is rather interesting because in most churches, on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, when you go to church to celebrate Christmas, it's not Matthew's Gospel you hear. It's Luke's Gospel that doesn't even have that very direct, or however you want to say it, strong connection of the fulfillment of the Messiah. It's telling not a very different story, but a different take on the same story. Luke's gospel is talking about Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem and the shepherds. That's the story we get on Christmas Day and Christmas Eve. Matthew's gospel is usually only read on Epiphany, which is the first Sunday of January, in which the Magi come. And the Magi are only, or the wise men, or sometimes they're called the three kings. That is only read, that story, on Epiphany. And that Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, although telling the same story, have very different takes on the story. Luke has the shepherds, and Matthew has the Magi. They both have a young woman, a maiden, a quote virgin birth. They do both have that, but they're telling different parts of the story, and it's once again Matthew's gospel, St. Matthew's gospel, that has this strong Davidic, meaning Jewish connection to the Anointed One or the Messiah, which is once again interesting, because that's not the one that we read on Christmas. And so there's something there. But when Matthew was writing, well, let me say it this way: when the author of Matthew's gospel was writing, because we don't actually know who wrote Matthew's gospel, there was this understanding that when he looked and saw the word Alma, he connected that, even though that does not mean necessarily an unmarried virgin. He connected the cultural connotations with that word to that word.
And Dillon's going to get into that in just a minute. Actually, I think now's actually a good time to talk about that. So,
okay.
Just to really wrap up, the Hebrew word Alma didn't mean virgin, just meant young woman or a maiden. And then it was translated into Greek eventually, and Dillon in a minute is going to talk about why, when we translate it into Greek, the whole Jesus story picks up a lot of new meaning. So an important cultural aspect here is that the Bible's audience at this time in history, after the death of Jesus, especially because of Paul, the audience was largely Greek. Even a lot of Jews didn't speak Hebrew anymore.
Right.
They were speaking Greek. So the Bible had to be in a language that people could actually read when it was beginning to be written down and these stories were circulating, right? So we see a shift from Hebrew to Greek, and a virgin birth is a Greek concept. The word God, even like God, which we still use today, that is not a word that the original Hebrews, the people who worshiped the Israel's God, who we worship today if you are a Christian, they didn't use the word God. That's a Greek word. So Christianity really caused a big merging between Hebrew and Greek culture in many ways. So Dillon, can you talk about why it's super important in the context of this virgin birth of a Messiah? Again, if we're using the word Messiah and you want more context, go back and listen to episode 2 on the word Christ. We talk all about the Messiah prophecy.
Right. So there's the messianic prophecy in the book of Isaiah, or as I like to say, Isaiah. And
why do you like to say that?
Well, because that's the Jewish way of saying it.
Even Jesus isn't the Jewish way of saying. How would he have said his name? Do you know?
Yeshua.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's interesting because going back, so there is this passage in Genesis, Genesis 3:15, where some people have read into this phrase something that's not necessarily there directly, and it speaks of the seed of a woman, the promise of a seed of a woman for one to come. That's the wording of it, and this is in Genesis 3:15. And people have, after the fact, connected that passage, the seed of a woman of the one to come, with the virgin birth, that this is foretelling that Mary will come, and this is what it is. If you talk to Jewish scholars about this, that's not what it means. I am not a Jewish scholar. I'm not a Jewish rabbi. I'm a Christian pastor. And so I'm not going to get into that with details, but there's different interpretations and different understandings of that phrase in the book of Genesis. Where the virgin birth and the Virgin Mary really start to get some traction is once again in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which it says, behold, now this is the translated English version. It says, version, excuse me. It says, behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. Right? So, and Emmanuel meaning God save us, or God with us, meaning once again that in the person of Jesus we see the fullness of God. Okay? So that's the English, right? So if you were to look in your Bible right now, your English version Bible, and you were to page to Isaiah chapter 7:14, you're going to say, oh no, it says it right here. The virgin, it's going to be a virgin. If you look at Hebrew Bibles with the understanding of what the Jews thought at that time, there is no concept of a miraculous virgin birth. It's not found in the Old Testament. It says, behold, a young woman, behold, a maiden will bear a child, a son, and she shall call him and have the name Emmanuel.
And what's interesting is when it says young woman, who else would birth a child?
Right.
Young women are who have always birthed children.
Right. So the miraculous part of like that the Holy Spirit will be the one that will do it. That's not in that passage. The idea that I'm not saying that Mary was not a virgin. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is if some people, and they continue to do, look at these specific passages and kind of parcel them together or put them together. As I was taught in seminary, you always need to go back to the original language to which the text was written in.
Right. The English translation is a paraphrase at best.
Right. And the passage that many people go to is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And if you look at it in the original Hebrew, it does not say virgin. And once again, as Samantha said, there was and is a Hebrew word for virgin. That's not what was used. It was alma, meaning young woman or maiden, could be a virgin. I'm not saying that it can't be. Yes. It could be a virgin. It could be an unwed woman. So I'm not saying or taking that away that she wasn't. It's just interesting because in order to make a direct connection and fulfillment, the two passages, although they have some overlaps, and when I'm talking about the two passages, I'm talking about the fulfillment passage in Isaiah, and then Matthew's gospel. That's where we get this again. We get this connection. So Matthew's gospel, which was written in Greek, does say virgin. It does not say young woman. It does not say maiden, because in the Septuagint there was this understanding, and I don't know if
Septuagint is the Greek translation.
Septuagint is the Greek translation. I'm not sure if we want to get into that yet, but in the early days of the Jesus movement, which would eventually, in a couple centuries, become the Christian church, you had Jewish people, the Hebrew people, who accepted Jesus as the Messiah, as the Anointed One, and they continued to practice parts of Judaism and also accept Jesus as the Messiah. They had a very Jewish understanding of the Jesus movement. You had that. And then you also had the Gentile movement, particularly with Paul and others, and they were not
Can you explain the word Gentile?
Gentile means anyone who is not Hebrew, anyone who is not Jewish.
Yeah. It's important to me that we don't throw
Yes, I'm
words
sorry.
around. No,
Yes.
it's not your fault. That's
No,
why
good.
I stop you.
And so you have the early Jewish followers of Jesus remembering that Jesus was a Jew himself, and then you have the Greek and Roman and other Mediterranean groups that were following Jesus. They had no concept of the Jewish tradition. They didn't understand it. They were of, quote, a pagan origin. They were Greek and understood Greek and Roman mythology. They were of the pagan religions. They did not have any concept. So when they were hearing the Jesus story, and when they would hear the birth story, a virgin birth to them would make perfect sense. They would say, "Oh yeah, well Dionysius was his mother was a virgin and had a virgin birth, and all these Greek and Roman gods." That was common. The idea that God would come and send a special person or come in that person, and it would be a miraculous birth, a virgin birth, to Greek and other Mediterranean Christians, as we see in the Apostles' and Nicene Creed, because that's the traditions that they came out of. That was normal. That wasn't even a stretch for them to think that, oh, well, of course, the Holy Spirit was the one who provided Mary and assisted her in her pregnancy, and of course she was a virgin, and Jesus was the Son of God, and that was commonplace.
Yeah. I picture Jews and Jesus followers. I picture Paul specifically talking to these people living in a Greek culture, trying to explain the Jesus story, and they're like, "Oh yeah, a god, we have those. They're born of virgin women, and they're in the skies fighting like Zeus," and right, and they're using the word God or Theos, and Paul and these Jesus followers just saying, yeah, it's like that. Yeah, sure. So I teach ESL, English as a Second Language, classes often to college students who English is not their first language. And there are a lot of times, right? Like, so when I teach other college students, they call me Dr. Bise. When I teach ESL, they call me teacher. And I'm just like, yeah, sure. Yeah. Because sometimes you have to meet people where they are in their culture so you can get to the greater points. I'm not going to like have them spend their mental energy learning to call me something else, because in their culture, that's not what they did. Let's get into the stuff that really matters here. Right. So that's what Paul and all these people were doing, is like, yeah. God's like that. Yeah. Virgin birth. Yeah, sure. Okay. Now that we're past that, let's talk about Jesus.
And also, just to point out, I am not, clearly I am a Christian, I'm a Lutheran pastor. I have no problem with what the creeds state of the Virgin Mary. I don't necessarily have a problem with that personally, but once you start to study the biblical texts of the Hebrew Scriptures and the Greek New Testament, they have many strong parallels and overlaps. However, there are indeed differences, and we have to speak about those differences in a way that it's not all cut and dry. There's a lot of nuances that come with this. And many people can maybe wrap their mind around the Virgin Mary, that Mary was a virgin, but they have a really hard time wrapping their mind around that it was an absolute miraculous birth, and that the Holy Spirit was the one who provided Mary with a pregnancy. I have talked to a lot of people over the years, a lot of parishioners. They say, "Oh well, I can kind of get my mind around the Virgin Mary or the Maiden Mary, the young Mary." But I really struggle with the whole miraculous Holy Spirit thing. I'm not going to take a position on that. I'm just going to say that's up to the individual.
I will gladly take a position.
Sure.
I don't believe that Mary was a virgin. I also don't care. To me, that's
I'm not
that's
talking
not
about her being a virgin. I'm talking about
the miraculous birth.
what was it a miraculous birth?
So I think that's the same thing, though. So whenever I say I don't believe she was a virgin, that means I'm saying I believe there was an earthly father.
Oh, okay. Oh, I get what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, and I believe, I don't know if it was Joseph, or I think there was scandal there. And for me, that actually adds to the story of like Jesus was birthed out of scandal. I think of, if you read, is it Matthew that begins with Jesus's lineage? The Gospel of
Yes.
Matthew?
Mm-hmm.
And what's really...
Well, Luke has it too, but it doesn't...
Right.
It doesn't come till much later, and Luke's and Matthew's lineage is different.
Yeah. Well, if you read the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, it goes through Jesus's lineage because it wants to prove that he's from the line of David, because that's the messianic prophecy, right? What's really interesting is 5 women are listed. And that is unusual. Usually lineage goes through men, but 5 women are listed. Mary, of course, is listed. Ruth is listed. What did Ruth do? She had sex with Boaz. She uncovered his feet. In Hebrew, feet means genitals, right? That's a symbol for genitals. So she had sexual relations with Boaz before they were married. There's scandal in Jesus's line through women. There's Bathsheba, who King David killed her husband, and then she was pregnant with King David, right? There's, again, scandal. There's 5 women. Who are the other ones? There's Tamar, right? Scandal in her story. Who's the 5th? Mary.
Hagar.
Ruth. No. Mary. Ruth. Tamar. Bathsheba.
I don't know. I'm not good at
sure.
naming those things.
There's a 5th, but if you look at the through line of those 5 women, their story, there's sexual scandal, right? Women are supposed to be pure during this time. They can actually be harmed or stoned to death at some points in history if they are not a virgin and they sleep with somebody who's not their husband, right? So it's really dangerous. And yet the Gospel of Matthew includes this to show this is where Jesus comes from these women who, by the way, broke societal rules so that the line of David could be kept alive and follow to Jesus. I think that's really compelling, and we could do a whole episode on that. I do want to say quickly that if this episode is hard for you because you're somebody where the virgin birth is really foundational, great, you can have it. You can totally have it. If that's like a corner piece of your understanding. I do want to say, though, Rob Bell said this years ago, and I really love it. The person who's radical, the word radical comes from radish, like a root vegetable. So oftentimes the people who say something radical, they're actually going back to the root of the thing. So if this sounds really radical and it's just nothing like you've ever heard before, like, I can't believe it, these people are saying that the virgin birth might not be a thing. And, well, yeah, a lot of Christians throughout history did not believe this. Actually, if you go back to the root of the original language, it's not there. The shift really happens, like Dillon's talking about, whenever the Gospels have to be communicated to a Greek audience and they are used to the understanding that gods are born of virgin women. So you kind of pick up meaning to simplify it.
And there's the tradition of Dionysius, whose father was Zeus. This idea that Dionysius, the god of wine and fertility and light, is the one that is...
And what?
And light, like a light beam.
Oh, like the opposite of dark. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
When is the legend of Dionysius to be born? In the middle of the winter, near the winter solstice. So Dionysius, who brings the warmth of wine, is born of a virgin mother and comes and provides light in the midst of darkness in the winter. We have had multiple episodes on Jesus being the Christ, and I accept and I trust that Jesus is the light of the world, and the one that comes. But to deny that there are other stories like that in antiquity is inappropriate. There were stories like that in antiquity. There were understandings of gods and goddesses and other types of things. This was not original just to the Jesus story. That's the story that I was given and I accept as the truth. and it does something for me, but it doesn't do something for everyone, and I'm fully aware of that. The other interesting thing is we haven't talked about, are we going to talk about perpetual virginity?
Yeah, that's the next thing that I want to talk about. Yeah.
Oh, lovely.
So some traditions are rooted in Mary's virginity historically. However, it's not been the only or even the dominant way of understanding the Jesus story throughout Christian history. But some people even take it beyond Jesus's birth, and they believe that Mary's ongoing and perpetual virginity, meaning she was just a virgin forever, always. However, that is not biblical. The Gospels do state that Jesus had brothers and sisters. And over the centuries, a lot of Christian apologists have kind of reinterpreted this and said, oh no, that means cousins. That means cousins. But a majority of scholars find this research very unconvincing. Mary likely had given birth to multiple children. And there's some definite leaps, like mental leaps, and you have to ignore some like hard facts to believe that Mary was always a virgin. And some doctrine really clings to her perpetual virginity. She never had sex. She was always a virgin, but there's not much to support that.
Now, this is an interesting thing too. Many Christians, I'll say it this way, many Christians who are of the Protestant traditions, most do not believe in the perpetual virginity. Yeah. The perpetual virginity, for the most part, lives on in the Roman Catholic specifically and the Eastern Orthodox traditions. Most Protestants do not believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. Why? Because of modern biblical scholarship and archaeology and other types of things. If you were to go to most Lutheran churches, and I'm just saying Lutheran because we're Lutheran, but if you were to go to most Lutheran churches and take a poll or a survey of people sitting in a Lutheran church, the pews, almost all of them would say, no, I definitely don't believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. If you ask most modern Lutheran pastors, they're going to say, no. Modern historicity and scholarship says, no, that's definitely not a thing. That was a specific understanding and take for a while. However, if you are Lutheran and you look at what's called the Lutheran Confessions in the small clad articles, isn't that a fun word? In the Lutheran Confessions, in the small clad articles, official Lutheran teaching, because remember that Martin Luther was coming out of the Roman Catholic Church, and many people think, oh, he just wanted to get rid of Mary and get rid of the saints and do all that. Actually, that's not very true. There were other things he wanted to get rid of, and the intercession of the saints, but he definitely didn't want to get rid of Mary or the saints. He just didn't want us praying to them. And in the small clad articles of the Lutheran Confessions, it is officially in there that the Lutheran Church believes in the perpetual virginity of Mary. So it's fascinating that in one of our confessional books of the Lutheran Church, the perpetual virginity of Mary that comes out of the Roman Catholic tradition is still very much there, quote unquote, officially, but nobody believes it, right? So it's interesting because, again, you get the stories of Jesus having siblings, or some people have kind of tried to stretch it to be cousins or some other family connection or something like that. Yeah. But that's a stretch.
Well, for cultural context too, remember that it's only been 500 years since the common person could read the Bible. It used to be only in Latin, which means only Catholic leaders, only religious clergy could read it and then tell you what it said. So only 500 years ago could common people start reading it. And then it's even been less time than that people have access to translation information. So you don't need to be fluent in Hebrew or Greek to have access to translation books and programs and all kinds of things. I mean, Dillon and I on our computers have something called Accordance, where you can look up original Bible language and see what did that word originally mean. So now the common people or Protestant pastors can actually look at like, what was this word in the Hebrew? What was it in the Greek? What was it in the Latin? And what did it get translated to? Because language, translation doesn't work where like, this word means this. No, because language is cultural. If we don't have a word for that in our language, we've got to stretch it and find something else. So it's messy.
And I will go on the record to say that I personally definitely do not believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. I don't think there's any validity to that in the Bible. I do think that was and still remains in some traditions a common understanding and a common teaching. I'm not opposed to it. I just don't. That's not persuasive to me.
Yeah.
And that is different, and that is very different from that of the miraculous birth of Jesus, pointed towards in Luke and Matthew, the Christmas story, and Mary being a virgin. Those two things are different.
Well, and some people get really dogmatic, and there was a time in history when the attachment of a woman's hymen was all connected with her virginity, and people really cared about that, and they'd even check and like just in ways that we don't typically understand it anymore.
Well, and thanks be to God for that. People had problems.
People had problems, and they really wanted to control women, which was so interesting. Well, they still do. But people believed that if Mary actually gave birth, if Jesus went through her, again, this episode, like we said in the beginning, is not for kids, so we're just going to speak about it. If baby Jesus actually went through her birth canal and she pushed her out of her body, that her hymen would break and her virginity was gone, which to them was a real problem. Again, people got very dogmatic. People who in the early church said, pointed to what we're pointing to right now. Actually, if about 2,000 years ago, even 1,500 years ago, if Dillon and I were saying these things, we'd be burned at the stake. It was heretical. How dare you say Jesus was born out of Mary's body? So they believed that and this is true. To this day, there is some Christian doctrine that says Mary didn't birth Jesus. He was just appeared out of her stomach, because we can't possibly have her hymen break and her virginity in question. So just the idea, we'll get there. We'll talk about that at the end, because I have a story about a statue. But I do want
to... And also, real quick, during the 19th century, so the mid to late 1800s, up until about the 1920s, in the Presbyterian Church in the United States, there was a split between what was called the fundamentalists and the modernists. And as science became something, science and medicine particularly became something more prominent, and we understood more about the human person and the body and the cosmos, people had to start to reconcile the stories of the scriptures with science and medicine. And more modernist theologians and biblical scholars said, well, these things can be paralleled. They can't necessarily be reconciled, but they can be paralleled in understanding them in new ways, including the virgin birth. And the fundamentalists said, oh, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We cannot do this. So in the Presbyterian Church in the United States, there was a split between the fundamentalists and the modernists, and one of the things that the fundamentalists said that pastors in particular had to uphold is, if you don't believe in the virgin birth, then you're not a Christian. You cannot be a Christian pastor. That was it. If you can't affirm that, then you're out. And that was in the 20s, which is a fairly amount of time ago, but not too much. That was the hill. That was one of the hills that they would die on.
Well, and remember some context, even just a few hundred years before what Jesus is talking about. What Dillon is talking about is the Catholic Church, up until a certain time in history, especially like the Protestant Reformation about 500 years ago, the Catholic Church had control. They were in cahoots with the government. They had control. The Pope had control. And they were very pious. They wanted people clothed. They were really obsessed with civility and mannerisms and all that kind of stuff. So Then the Reformation happened, right? Martin Luther, we had, I think it's episode 3 was Protestant, right? That word. So the Reformation happened. So you have this movement of people saying, we want the Bible in our language, in German, and other common languages, right? So the Catholic Church starts to lose control. And then in Italy and some other areas, but especially Florence, there was this thing called humanism, which kind of evolved into modernism, which Dillon's talking about. I'm really simplifying it here, but humanism. And one thing that humanists really loved was the naked body, right? So you had the Catholic Church, who up until this point in history, so for about 1,500 years, 1,500 years, a little less than that, the Catholic Church reigned. The Pope was in control. Catholics had all of the power. And then the Reformation happened, and they're like trying to keep their power. And what do we know about people who are trying to keep their power? They're going to control people, right? Because they want to keep their power. They think their way is the right way. The Reformation started to take hold. They're losing power, so they're putting on more control, more rules, more legality, more doctrine. And then you have humanism that's really rising up. And I think of Michelangelo. So Dillon and I are going to Italy in a couple months. So I've really gone down a Michelangelo rabbit hole. He is painting naked bodies, right? He still identifies as Catholic, though. There's a lot of people who are still identifying as Catholic, but they're humanists. So a lot of their kind of freedom and liberation and believing that humans have control over their own life and it's not all just God. That's like humanism 101 in a really simplified way. They care about the naked body. So Michelangelo did the Sistine Chapel, right, in the Vatican, and there's naked bodies everywhere. Some people really didn't like that. In fact, a lot of the naked bodies were covered up, and they've since been repaired on some of his paintings in the Sistine Chapel. So that's really interesting. So I say that just to give some context to like this virgin birth. The Catholics really held on to that for a long time, and sometimes still do, but as we'll see at the end when I tell a story about the destruction of a statue 2 years ago, not all Catholics are still holding on tightly to the perpetual virginity of Mary. So the Reformation, humanism, about 500 years ago, was really rising up. The Catholic Church was losing control. So I want to go beyond. Go ahead.
Well, what I was thinking, too, is for some people that might be listening to this, I can just imagine what you might be thinking. Like, are you definitively saying that the virgin birth doesn't matter, that there was no virgin birth, that there was no miraculous birth with the Holy Spirit being a part of Jesus?
We're saying it's not 100% clear.
What we're saying, that's not exactly what we're saying. What we're saying is that in these stories, particularly the stories that give us the birth of Jesus and the virgin birth that we know in the New Testament in the Greek text, only come in Matthew and Luke. And there is nuance even between those two stories of Jesus' birth and the virginity of Mary. There is nuance there. There's things that have little tweaks here and there, and our purpose of this episode is to talk about those nuances in a way of saying, hey, what we kind of have understood as one quote cohesive story, that has never really been the case, and so once again, I think Samantha already said this, but if the virgin birth and if the virginity of Mary and the miraculous birth of Jesus is compelling to you and it uplifts you and it does something for you, we're not here to take that away from you.
Yeah, it's not the hill we die on.
It's not the hill we die on, and nor should we. I think in some ways it can be, if understood in a nuanced way, I think it can be, and it is, I'm going to go on the record and say personally, I think it is a beautiful way to understand the story. It gives some oomph. It gives some old Roman and Greek understandings, which we understand, excuse me, which we still understand today. It's how are you holding that story? Are you holding it with your fists clenched tight of it can't be any other way? Or are you holding it, wow, this is just so
open palms,
beautiful and poetic, and it's telling a greater truth. Whether or not it's historically true, we don't ever know. We're never going to know. I really want to talk about this for a second. We're never going to know the historicity of whether Mary was actually a virgin or not. We can debate that all day. We can look at the passage from Isaiah. We can look at the passages from Matthew
look at translations.
and Luke. We can look at translations. Was it Alma? Was it a young woman or a maiden? Was she actually a virgin? That's people writing about someone else. Remember that even the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are being written 50 to 60 years after Jesus' death. These people didn't even know Mary. They were learning from stories of being told orally. So we could debate the virginity of Mary and the miraculous birth all we want. It's whether or not that story becomes transformative to us and points us to something greater, which is the goodness that Jesus brings through Mary who birthed him, whether it was miraculous or not.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Christmas is coming up, and I know that we think differently about this. Some people do, but as a pastor, I'm thinking, oh, well, am I destroying someone's Christmas story? That's not what I want to do. I don't think that's what Samantha wants to do.
But I think the opposite is also true. So in a lot of ways, this podcast is me talking to who I was 7 years ago.
Yeah, that's
for me,
beauty.
and I've talked to a lot of people, I'm not the only one. The concept of the virgin birth, full stop. I can't do it. I can't.
Yeah.
Some people are more pragmatic. We are children of a scientific revolution. So so we understand things they didn't back then. This virgin birth was not a concept in our culture. It's full stop for me. I can't get there. But then whenever you look and actually there's an argument to be made that Mary wasn't a virgin, then you can kind of get beyond that barrier a little bit where it's
Correct.
okay, leave some room for me. If you're telling me that in order to have a Christian faith, I need to believe that Mary was a virgin, for a lot of people, that's a barrier and they can't get beyond it.
I totally agree.
I think equally, this might destroy it for some people, but also it can allow people, it can just open the door a little bit. And okay, if that's not something that I have to believe to be transformed by this story, then thank you very much.
Well, and before we move on, let me just say this: when the ecumenical councils, meaning groups of bishops, were coming together to look at what books of the Bible, what books of the scriptures will be in, and what will be here, and what will be there.
They just had a pile of texts, and they didn't even know what was going to go in the Bible. People decided what was going to be in the Bible. Is
correct,
what Dillon is saying.
And the canon. Technically and officially, the canon is all the books together. So for most Protestants, it's 66 books. For Catholics, it's a little bit more. Some Protestants, like the Lutheran Church, accept the Apocrypha, which is a couple of old Hebrews.
So can I just really ground that before you go on?
Let me just say a couple of Hebrew scriptures that are part of it, the Old Testament.
I lost it. Hold on. Oh, I just want to really ground it. As we can't even agree as Christians what the Bible is.
Correct.
That's all. Okay, keep going.
Correct. Because Protestants understand one thing, Eastern Orthodox understand another, and Roman Catholics understand another. And it's interesting because we have four Gospels that tell a similar story of the life of Jesus. And yet, here we are in Advent, soon coming to the 12 days of Christmas. We're talking about virginity, specifically Mary's virginity.
Well, this episode is going to be posted on December 22nd.
Oh, perfect.
So right before Christmas.
And if you were to read Mark's Gospel, St. Mark's Gospel, and St. John's Gospel, and if they were the only Gospels that we had, which some people in the early Jesus movement, they only had those Gospels. They would never know anything about a virgin birth, and they would never know anything about Jesus's actual, Mary's virginity. Let me say it that way. Mary's virginity and the miraculous birth of Jesus. In Mark's Gospel, which is the oldest Gospel, and John's Gospel, there is no virgin birth.
So for them, it wasn't an important part of the story.
Right, and there's no Christmas story.
There's no virgin birth in Matthew, right?
No, there's no virgin birth in Mark.
Does Matthew have it?
Matthew and Luke have it.
Okay, all right.
But Mark and John don't have any Christmas story. They don't have any shepherds. They don't have any magi. They don't have any virgin birth.
So interesting.
There's no birth of Jesus at all. And that's why a lot of people, when it comes to proclaiming Easter, I don't want to get on this because I could really take it a different way. You get the Easter story in all four Gospels. You do not get the Christmas story in all four Gospels.
Well, and this might just be a teaser because I don't know if we're going to do this year, maybe next year. Inn is not a proper translation for the nativity story. It wasn't like a hotel as we know it.
No, it was someone's.
Right? So
it was someone's
house.
Well, it was a room. Yeah,
like
a specific little room.
A specific room of and that's a whole other episode.
And there's
actually a lot there.
And there was no innkeeper.
Right, there was no innkeeper.
That's not the Bible.
It was likely somebody that they were related to, and they didn't have room in their house, so it was a room like where the animals were kept. And so this idea, like, if you were an innkeeper, would you turn away a pregnant woman? Well, it wasn't an innkeeper. It's not a business owner. Bethlehem was not a major city. There was no need for an inn. Okay, that's a whole other episode. So we still have more to say about virgin. So let's go beyond Mary.
Oh, I was really... I know. My goodness, that was so good. I wanted to add so much more. Because I just want to say this one thing. And then the Magi... The Magi, when you get that story, which is only in Matthew's Gospel, it's definitely not part of the Christmas story, because when you read that the Magi come to see Jesus and Mary, Jesus and Mary welcome the Magi into a home. They're already in a settled home, is the Greek word for home. They're not in some makeshift outer house or a stable or a cave or something like that. They're not there. And Jesus was probably about 2 years old. That's what many scholars think about that. So he had already been settled. Okay, well, we
could do a whole episode just on unpacking.
Let's get back to virginity.
Okay, so let's give some cultural context within Christianity beyond Mary. So we're not talking so much about Mary. We are going to come back to her at the end. But an important piece of cultural context, because again, I study language and culture behind these words. There's a whole word there, a whole world behind every word, is that in antiquity, to be a virgin in some ways simply meant not to have a husband. So yes, it was connected to marriage status or to sexual status. Have you been sexually involved with somebody? But it was also connected to your marriage status. And remember, at times in history, you actually weren't considered married if you didn't consummate the marriage, if you didn't have sex immediately after. And people
watch.
This is really sick, but yeah, people would watch to make sure that the marriage was finalized. And that's
Thank God that's
over, yeah. So virginity was closely connected to the construct of marriage during this time. So to be a virgin was seen as not belonging to somebody else and therefore belonging to yourself. And I don't want to overlay modern feminist understandings on this, but to be a virgin, especially whenever you aged as a woman, was also seen as belonging to yourself. It was a certain independence, right? So it has cultural implications pointing to the strong possibility that despite all the systems working against you as a woman, you had enough wealth and resources to survive without a man. So let's talk about nuns. When we think about nuns, especially during the Middle Ages, but when we think about nuns taking a vow of celibacy and living in a commune, right? Or a convent, this can be seen as a sort of liberation for some nuns. It isn't for a lot of nuns just them choosing to devote their life to God and servitude. It's also another option. If you are a woman for much of antiquity and much of history, your options were slim picking. You could become a nun, or you become a mother. And your choices are to be a virgin or to be an excellent mother. Those are really your choices in womanhood. Not much else, right? So to be a nun was another way to say, I don't want a husband or children for some women. It was actually liberating. So to be a virgin, to remain a virgin, to even in some ways renew your virginity, because maybe you did have sex and then you decided, I want to be a nun. So you can kind of like renew this vow of virginity.
Yeah, that's...
Nuns weren't, I don't want to speak for all nuns, but even today, sometimes to be a nun is an option to not go the route of serving your husband and children for the rest of your life, right? So, I mean, newsflash, being a wife and mother has never been something that every single woman wants. Some people think that motherhood is the only way to express womanhood. It is not, and it never has been. And there were times in history when becoming a nun was the only other option. So that was actually this like empowered thing to do. Not like, oh, I want to be a virgin forever and just pray to God forever. That can be beautiful. For some women, it was also, I don't want to be a wife and mother. I do not want that life of servitude that looks more like slavery to me. I'm not interested. So it was empowering.
But the church also, especially the medieval church, the medieval Catholic Church, especially in Europe, saw virgins as almost venerated. Now that's not worshipped, but venerated, lifted up among others, in that taking a vow to devote oneself to God, and also, like Samantha said, many of them were trying to understand who they were themselves, and also not have to come to the plights of what was going on in terrible marriages and having to go through pregnancies.
Well, and remember, childbirth, you could die. Like, it was common to die. Oh, sorry, did I just pull it out of your mouth?
No, that's fine.
Go ahead.
But virgins that was a specific class even of saints. I mean, there are many saint virgins in the church. One of the reasons why they have become a saint, someone who we look to now in the Protestant tradition, not pray to, but look to, are the virgins. Many of them women who have sought a different life outside of marriage, outside of birthing children, and many of these women were looked up to. Some, you get the old understandings of purity and chastity. Yes, I'm sure that was there. But also this idea that these were very learned women. They would learn how to read, and many of them would be teachers. They would go on to do different types of medical things.
Yeah.
And so...
well, some people today think that the Catholic tradition is to have 6 kids. No, the Catholic tradition is to have 6 kids and 3 of them die before they're 2.
Correct.
And now you're left with 3. So this like big Catholic family thing, even, and traditions evolve, so have at it. You do you. I mean, of course, if you want that, go for it. But the Catholic tradition is to have a lot of kids, but half of them die before they reach what now we consider school age. So
there was a problem in medieval Europe, and this is documented, that society, there was a growth of the monastic tradition. So women and men who were deciding to go in to become monks and nuns and friars, and there were people writing in that time, no one's going to get married anymore. No one's going to get married anymore. Men will not have wives to have children. There were people writing about this. There were people concerned about it. And it's very interesting to me, because if you look at the biblical scriptures, especially in the writings of Paul and others, even on the lips of Jesus, you will see this idea of calling people to singleness and not having children. Well, and that is, so I know some people are like, well, let's talk about a biblical ethic. Well, there's a strong biblical ethic.
Well, we had our episode on
marriage. I know, but
yeah.
This has to do with people, not just women being virgins and living in singleness, but men as well. And this is interesting because this is both supported in church tradition, but it's also supported in the biblical texts.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
What are we going to do with that? No, I don't know.
So let's just make a little leap and talk about women and sexuality. So within the context of Christianity, because again, virginity is all wrapped up with women and their expectations surrounding sexuality. So you have these nuns. If I think of myself, if I was raised into a family many centuries ago, and I saw, which was very likely, there's a high probability of this, if I saw my mother give birth to 4 children, because maybe I was the oldest, and then 2 of my siblings died, and then my mother during her 5th pregnancy died during her pregnancy, I might want to become a nun. I might want to join the convent because I'm not interested in having children that I have to watch die. I'm not interested in risking my own life to have those children. I'm not interested in having to serve my husband and being seen as less than. I'd rather go spend my days with the community of women where I get to read and serve in a different way, right? So for a lot of women, that's a choice of liberation. I think that's really important. So, and that's connected to virginity. They are a virgin, yes, but it's not just this pious, like, oh, I'm so pure. It's actually the emboldened choice, right? So let's talk about women and sexuality. 3 women that we hear the most about in Christianity is Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Eve. And people have kind of created tropes of these women. Like, these are our choices in Christianity. Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was the supposed virgin. Mary Magdalene, who was demon-possessed and had to be exorcised, is the story, right? And then for a while, people thought she was a prostitute or a sex worker, which is not true.
That is not true.
Not true at all. Is it a pope who made that up, right? A pope made that up and said it and spread it, so that's not true. But the story goes that she was demon-possessed and had to be exorcised or saved from that. And then Eve, the sinner. So our choices, so Mary of Magdalene was aligned with a demon, Eve was aligned with a demon or the devil, and Mary was the virgin. So we can either be aligned with evil or we can be a virgin. Those are the women options for women. If you don't look deeper into the Christian story.
Okay, there we go. But
those are the 3 that people know. If you ask people who's Ruth, a lot of people don't know.
Well, no, because
who's Tamar, a lot of people don't know.
Men have been ruling the church. Also, like the great, Deborah in the Hebrew Scriptures, one of the great, in the book of Judges, you get the great leader Deborah. You get people like Tabitha and Lydia in the New Testament. These very strong women. You get Junia, a great follower of Paul, a woman. You get women in high positions as deacons. Chloe's people. You get all these strong women, and they've been suppressed by no other. There's no other explanation for this, and I feel like I'm at liberty to speak about this. There has been no other suppression of these women except by male pastors and bishops like myself. I'm not a bishop, I'm a pastor, but I'm saying historically bishops have been men, and they have also... And popes, and they've also suppressed this. And...
So what women are left with is these very basic, you can be a pure virgin or you can be aligned with evil, and those are kind of the main people that we know. People know who Mary Magdalene is, people know who Eve is, and people know who Mary, the mother of Jesus is, but otherwise the other ones have been suppressed.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think some people would just say, let's throw the whole Bible out, it's trash, it's terrible. The stories are terrible.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
No. Listen, and indeed there are some horrific and troubling stories in the Bible. There's no doubt about that, and we can talk about that all day. However, when you actually dig deeper into the Bible and you look at the beauty of it and the nuance of it and the original languages and you study those, it can become something very, very transformative and beautiful. And this is what we try to do here on our podcast. We don't take just the general things of, this is what it is, or this is what people have said. No, we dig into it, we take it seriously, we look into the nuances of it, And we say, hey, people have believed this, people have believed that, they believe something a little bit in the middle. And that's always been the case. It remains the case. And that's the beauty of the Christian tradition, even with this topic of virginity.
Well, and if we're talking about virginity, sexuality comes in. And another side note is a lot of people are like, oh, abortions aren't, I mean, I'm really going to touch on a note, and I'm not even saying, I'm not talking about my stance on abortion, but I am telling you biblically, when people say birth control is not biblical, abortion is not biblical, read again and do a little extra outside reading. Myrrh was seen as a contraceptive. Myrrh is even linked to aborting fetuses, right? So when Esther and other women were going to see the king, what that meant is the king was going to have sex with them. There's not just a line of women going to see the king just for fun, to sit down and have intellectual conversation. The king was going to have sex with these women. So what did these women do? They covered themselves in myrrh for many months before seeing the king. Why? Because covering yourself in myrrh was seen as a contraceptive. Women there's like this, if you read the Bible, there's kind of this like hidden transcript of women's wisdom, which I'm really obsessed with, hidden there, because again, men are often the ones who are writing the Bible and preserving the text, so it's lost to men. Myrrh was birth control. Myrrh was used as an abortive method, and a lot of people now are picking up on this, and there are current studies done by the National Institute of Health specifically, and a few more, where they are finding actually levels that are vaginally inserted of myrrh actually do control birth. So women were doing it in biblical times too. This isn't new. Women wanted controls over their body. Sex workers, they didn't, like Esther and all these people who were going in to have sex with the king, they didn't want to become pregnant, so they were taking matters into their own hands, right? So even non-virgins had this like control over their body, and I think that's really important for this conversation.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree.
And again, I'm not advocating that everybody should be going and having abortions. So
I am not advocating for that at all either.
But I am saying we can't use the Bible to make that point, because actually it's right there that women were doing that.
There's also a difference between having a woman having autonomy of her body and accessing contraception,
right, which is not a new thing,
and family planning. That can be linked to also reproductive care and the termination of a pregnancy. It can be linked, and yet at the same time they're also two totally separate things.
Yes.
They can be linked together, but they're two totally separate things.
Yeah.
So and we.
Yeah. That's just a little side note.
Yeah.
But so really the reason I brought up Mary the Mother, Mary Magdalene, and Eve is because to have these three basic tropes really denies the humanity of women. And let's circle back now to Mary. So we have this idea because of the myrrh and because of Mary's virginity and all this stuff. Womanhood is really being watered down, right? Like women are people. They're people and they're complex. And they do things that their society doesn't agree with, right? So I have spent my entire life listening to men tell their hunting stories. So bear with me. They talk about bows and bullets and blood and their victory, right? And women are in the room and women are expected to nod and be like, oh, so interesting. Yeah. And I know some women hunt too, so I don't mean to make generalizations here, but I used to hunt as a kid. Not my cup of tea. It's not for me. But my entire childhood, even as an adult, I hear men talk about their hunting stories and how it bled and how it ran, and they had to track its blood, right? It's bloody, and there's bullets, and there's violence, and there's victory. And I think why that's really funny is because as soon as a woman gives birth, I can't tell you how many times I've talked about giving birth to my first or second child, the men in the room just get up and leave. They can't stomach it. How dare? And oftentimes the same men who will spend an hour talking about how they killed a deer. And I think that's really interesting. And it just kind of shows what our culture, I'm not calling out men, I'm just saying our culture is okay with some violence. For example, this is really dystopian. I've probably said this before because I say it all the time. If we go to like a store and go into the toy aisle, we have pretend swords and guns that we give children. And yet when a woman talks about giving birth, ooh, stop it. We don't want to hear about that. that whole thing. So this is true in Christianity too. A woman birthed Jesus the Christ. A woman did that. And it was and Jesus didn't just magically appear out of her stomach. She birthed him. There were labor pains. There was blood. There was the afterbirth. There was a placenta, right? Somebody, I don't even know how they did it. They didn't have scissors. Scissors weren't invented yet. They had to cut the placenta. There was nursing. There was breastfeeding, right? It was undoubtedly painful and violent and bloody. And just like hunting, right? There's victory there. There's a victory, right? You did it. But our culture can't stand to show it or talk about it. We cringe. And yet we have guns in the toy aisle. And we have our little kids sword fighting. And we have video games with all this violence, and we have men hunting and talking about it, and women are expected to sit down and listen, but birth stories, we can't stomach it. What?
I think that's a very powerful connection.
Yeah, I think
I've been sitting here quiet the whole time thinking about that, going back and forth. I think that's a very powerful connection.
Yeah,
and there's some deep truth to that.
Yeah. So the nativity scene was bloody, right? The nativity scene is not this watered down version. A hill that I do die on is, for me, I don't buy nativity scenes with white characters. I need, for my own understanding and faith, I need a brown Jesus. I need a brown Mary, because that's what they were. I can't do white. Also, you can't find nativity scenes with blood all over it. So I'm not even advocating that we should do that. But I am saying, for me, when I look at a nativity scene, I need to remember that Mary had just given birth. If you have given birth, you know that your stomach is swollen for a couple weeks. You are bleeding for a while. So there was, for weeks, for many weeks, sometimes like a month or more. You're bleeding. Women today will wear diapers. I don't know what Mary did back then, right? But it's bloody, it's visceral, it's human, it's motherhood. And I think that matters. So...
and I think this might be upsetting, but I'm going to say it. A lot of times people will say, I want to know the truth, I want to know the truth, mm-hmm. I want to know the truth. And we have to get back to, biblical roots and on. They use all these kind of phrases. And but then sometimes when you actually tell them the truth, when you tell them the truth about the nativity scene, when you tell the truth about the nuances of the different phrasing and wording and understandings over time of people, some people don't like it. Mm-hmm. Some people don't. They say they want the truth, but they don't. They want, and this is going to sound like I'm getting snarky, and I'm not. I'm just saying, some people that say that they want the truth, no, they want their version of the truth. They want something that is sanitized and almost arguably fake. It's not even sometimes anywhere near close to the story, but it works for them.
I call it warm vanilla pudding. Like, it just goes down easy. People just want warm vanilla pudding.
Oh God, nice I want cold vanilla pudding. No, but I'm
butterscotch.
Butterscotch. But yeah. So I just get sometimes. I get disturbed almost thinking that some people that say, again, and I'll leave it at this, some people that say they want the truth, they don't. They want their understanding or their version of the truth, which is not the truth.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So there was blood at the nativity scene, is my point. And there's this artist, an Austrian artist, her name is Esther Strauss, and she made a statue of Mary birthing Jesus called The Crowning. And it is Mary actually birthing Jesus. Jesus is on his way out of her body. And this was on display at a Catholic church in Austria. And it was in an area. So obviously, I do a lot of research on like censorship and stuff. And I have to say this. Of course, so our brains are cultural organs. We know this because brains have been studied across cultures. Brains adapt to the culture that they're in. There's not one way to be human. And I say that because, of course, it's age appropriate, right? In our culture, things revolving around sexuality and childbirth and blood and that kind of stuff, we shelter children from it, right? In other cultures, that's not the truth, right? In other cultures, a 3-year-old is right there whenever their mother is giving birth to their sibling, right? And it's not an issue. In our culture, that's an issue. Of course, things are age appropriate. So this statue of Mary birthing Jesus, called the crowning, it was on display at a Catholic church, but it wasn't just like on the altar for anybody to see. You had to like walk to this space. So you didn't have to take your child if you didn't want to. So, and the official Catholic diocese is the one, they did not object to this, and it was asked to be on display, right?
No, they had it installed.
Right, they had it installed. So this isn't about the Catholic Church. This is just a small part of the community. But some people in the community had a real problem with this. So one person, who's still anonymous, this happened in 2022, by the way. They decided that and there were supporters, right? There were a lot of supporters in the community, some of them who were people of power. So they spoke up about it saying, yes, I'm glad this person vandalized it. So people thought that it was offensive to Mary to have her seen giving birth like this in this statue. So this person who thought that it was offensive to Mary for her to be seen giving birth to Jesus like this, beheaded Mary. Which is just so wild to me. Like, so you think it's offensive for Mary to be seen giving birth, but you don't think it's offensive to behead her. So that's just, like, the hypocrisy is really interesting. So anyway, this person had admirers, and a lot of people in the community applauded this act of vandalism. And again, this just happened in 2022, so just 2 or 3 years ago at this point. And I think that's super interesting because it shows that people still can't see, they want to see Mary as this just, she's a virgin, she's pure. We can't stomach the idea that she actually gave birth. And I want to make this point because this is really important.
Which is, yeah. Which is interesting because if you're of the Christian persuasion, the idea that Mary is connected to Jesus and Jesus is connected to Jesus, why would
Jesus is connected to Jesus?
Is that what I said? Yeah. Oh my, I'm sorry. That Mary is connected to Jesus and Jesus is connected to Mary. Mm-hmm. The idea that Mary, you have a human mother, mm-hmm. a human mother who is birthing the one whom we are called to follow. In some cases, worship. Why would you want to destroy or deny the mother or the depiction of the mother to which birthed the one whom you follow and worship? That is the craziest and most un-Christian thing I think you could ever even think about doing. So I can't say anymore. It's upsetting. It's upsetting.
So for context, so if what is offensive about Esther Strauss's statue to people is that Mary is partially nude, I have seen in churches many nude Jesuses hanging on a cross. So if we're offended with nudity, why aren't those being opposed?
That are bloody.
Well, that's my next point. If it's the blood that you don't like, I have seen countless crosses with Jesus hanging dripping blood, right? So if it's the nudity or the blood, we see that in the crucifixion all the time. If we think childbirth is too violent, we see violence all the time in the Easter story, all the time in the crucifixion and like the Good Friday crucifixion. So, and people don't have a problem with that. We are fine with the male body, but we are not fine with the female body who births. Like we're not, I mean the female body in general, but in this context, who births. And that's a real cultural hypocrisy that needs to be owned, right? We have this problem with women, and we can only see women as either aligned with evil or as a virgin like Mary in the context of Christianity. And that's really generalizing. I know it can be more complicated than that, but oftentimes those are the options. As a woman, I can say that. There's this cultural pressure of those are your options. You need to be a perfect wife and mother, or you can be a virgin nun. Like sometimes there doesn't feel like there's an in-between for the nuance of humanity and womanhood. So people, again, the nudity, the blood, I'm not sure what the problem is. People can't stand to see the humanity of Mary on display. We can hear hunting stories, but we don't want to hear women's birthing stories. Again, anytime I start to talk about what it was like to give birth to either of my children, men will get up and walk away. Sometimes women will too. And yet I don't think I've ever seen a woman get up and walk away when a man is telling his hunting story. which again is just as violent, just as much about victory and accomplishment and achievement and blood and violence, all these things, right? So just culturally, that's something that I think we need to wrestle with. Do you have anything else to say before we kind of wrap it up?
No, we thought this would be a short one.
I know, I thought this would be really short, but we had a lot to say. So, Mary's virgin status is something that will continue to be debated in Christianity, but I do hope that you all remember the translation that it's not a dead giveaway that Mary was a virgin. There's actually compelling evidence that perhaps maybe she wasn't. And again, it's not something Dillon and I would never argue with somebody about this out in the wild.
No,
right?
and I do want to also state this as we close out here. Every single week in worship, I lead people in either the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed, both of which speak of the Virgin Mary. And I don't have a problem saying that because I understand the nuance of it. I know that over time and space, people have understood the Virgin Mary in many different ways. Some have taken off more than others, and yet there has always been a diversity of understanding and the nuances around the Virgin Mary. Right? So when I lead people in the creeds and I say that, I say it with confidence, knowing that there's also nuances. I can hold, and some people might say, nope, that's an actual absolute, that's a contradiction, and you can't do it. And if that's where you find yourself, then that's fine. But you can indeed hold the nuance of it and the wording of it. Does that make sense?
It does.
In the same manner. I do it every single week because those words to which I have grown up with are transformative for me, and now I understand them in new ways. That doesn't take away the beauty of who Mary was as the mother of Jesus. Doesn't take it away for me.
Well, Dillon and I's first daughter, Tabitha, she was born on December 28th. Her due date was December 19th, and for a while we weren't sure if we were going to have a Christmas baby or not because she was a weekly and then 8 days late, right? She just kept being more and more late. But so that changed Advent for me and Mary was my path into understanding Advent because we were actually, like Mary, awaiting a child. Also, I am not saying that our birth experience was anything like Mary's. That is not at all the claim I'm making.
No.
However, it was during COVID. It was in 2020. There weren't vaccinations yet. So there was this question we didn't know because rules were changing. Was Dillon going to be allowed in the room with me? Was I going to have to wear a mask? Like, what was this birth going to be like? There was a great mystery, just like I imagined for Mary. They didn't know where she was going to give birth. They were traveling leading up to Jesus's birth, right? So Mary was my path into understanding the awaiting of Jesus's birth. And Mary's virginity was nowhere in that experience for me. In fact, thinking of her as a virgin didn't help me. It was a barrier. So understanding her as this woman who was about to give birth to a child, I wasn't unmarried when I birthed my child, but she was unmarried. She was being ridiculed by society, all of these things. Again, Mary was my path in to both motherhood and the Advent season. So I think that's really important. Do you have anything to say before we end?
Well, just that Jesus being born of a human mother makes Jesus all the more connected to our own humanity in being able to understand who God is. And so this idea that there was a human mother, her name was Mary, she birthed Jesus, God in human form. That's what I believe as a Christian. That is a beautiful when the humanity is left intact. You can really connect not only with Mary much more, but you can connect with the one whom she birthed, which is Jesus, the one whom we follow. I always think it's interesting. I'm going to close with this. on August 15th, or the closest Sunday to August 15th, in the Lutheran Church and in many other churches, there is a special day just for Mary. And we observe it in the Lutheran Church, and it's either on August 15th or near it. And the second reading as always comes from Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. And it talks about that the Son of God is born of a human woman. A human woman. It doesn't even say Mary's name. It just says a human woman. And so every time I lead my congregation in the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed, and I say, born of the Virgin Mary, I can hold both those old understandings of what the church believed and still believes, and also hold Galatians in mind, that Jesus was born of a human woman who had a human experience in birthing Jesus. And that, for me,
yeah,
I hold both together. Does that make sense?
It does. And if you understand, like we told you earlier in the episode, the translations of the Hebrew word and the Greek word to mean, especially in the Greek, kind of picked up this language of like a pure woman. Sure, Mary can be pure. And if the way we had to translate that to understand that purity was virginity in our cultural context, fine.
More than
then
fine.
Yes, I believe in Virgin Mary. I believe she was of pure heart.
Full of grace,
yeah.
Blessed for the Protestants that don't like to talk about Mary too much. Blessed among all women. Yikes! What are we going to do with that?
Yeah. So let's just end this episode quickly by saying that if you believe that Mary was a virgin, you are in good company with ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Have it. These episodes are mostly to dive into words that people think mean one thing, but really just to provide some nuance and say, maybe not. And if you're not buying it, fine. You're in good company with the ancient Greeks, who were the original hearers of the gospel. Fine. Great. Beautiful. Have it. But also, if that is a barrier to you, there could be another way to think about it that can be helpful and more transformative as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so be sure to listen next week. New episodes come out each Sunday, and you can follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcasts. Have a good week.
Have a wonderful week.